Good afternoon. This is Nicole Mumford, Vice President at CSCMP. I would like to thank you all for joining the CSCMP EDGE Sponsor Series today with Blume Global. I'm going to turn it over now to Adrian Gonzalez to introduce the session and today's speaker.
Great, thank you, Nicole, and thank you to everyone joining us today in this session on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which is transportation management. Now, I've been an industry analyst now for over 20 years, and there's certainly been a lot of changes in the transportation market over that time, and a lot of changes on the technology front too. So why holistic transportation management? Why is that such an important topic today? And for many companies out there, believe it or not, even though technology has been around for so long, why invest in a solution in a transportation management system at this time, perhaps for the first time for many companies out there? Well, the short answer is that we're not operating in 1999 anymore. And I think that's certainly become clear with everything going on right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. The challenges that transportation executives face today, as well as their needs and requirements, are very different today than they were 20 years ago, and they will undoubtedly continue to change in the years ahead. And the same is true with technology. As we've moved away from in-house client server type of implementations to cloud solutions and the emergence of operating platforms. So when it comes to holistic transportation management and how to successfully manage your transportation operations, when it comes to transportation management systems, the reality is that there's always something new to talk about because the innovation never stops. Because we have to keep up with the changing market dynamics and with changing customer requirements out there. So with that, I'm excited to share this virtual stage with Pervinder Johar, who is the CEO at Blume Global. I've known Pervinder for many, many years, and he's been on the front lines of holistic transportation management, both on the technology side as well as the end user side. So he brings a wealth of knowledge and experience and perspective to this topic. So Pervinder, thanks for joining me on this fireside chat today.
Thank you, Adrian. Good to speak to you again. You mentioned I remember all of our conversations from the years past about transportation, but things have evolved and they continue to change. So happy to talk about it more today.
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's always great to see you, and certainly look forward to our conversation today. So before we dive into kind of the topic of holistic transportation management, and we dive into the technology side of things as well, let's talk about how transportation management itself has changed over the past 20 years. I mean, from your perspective, what's changed the most, and what's new challenges and opportunities do companies face today?
Sure. I think I was reflecting on it this morning of how do I talk about transportation management. I live in San Francisco Bay Area. There's a house here called Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. And it reminds me of how transportation management had changed to some extent. So what happened is that in 1886, there's a woman who moved from Connecticut to San Jose. And there was a house with 8 rooms, a farmhouse. She started building and doing additions to the house in 1886 and kept on doing it till 1922, till she passed away. And that house went from 8 rooms to 160 rooms. More than 1,000 windows, right? Rooms which are not even connected to each other. Right? So if you're ever back here in California, maybe we should go and see that. And that's what has happened to transportation management. We think 20 years back, right, when the whole movement of prepaid to collect started between retailers and CPG companies in US, the focus was on primarily inbound transportation management, and what's the balance between the largest retailers and CPG companies, and a number of TMS systems came along with the philosophy of how do you manage transportation. Then came the .com times. Didn't really take off. It took almost 15, 20 years after when it all started that e-commerce evolved, and people built another philosophy on how do I do transportation management as an add-on to my inbound transportation side. Retailers started buying fleet, Motor carriers also had their own set of challenges. So that was asset management, and it's a different flavor of transportation management too. Right? And they built kind of their own ecosystem that how do I go do transportation. International was so small, relatively speaking, back 20 years back. It wasn't. I worked for one of the largest high-tech manufacturing companies in the world. It wasn't until 2008, 2009 we really moved manufacturing out to Asia. And today, a lot of our goods, whether kind of they're delivered via an e-commerce to a consumer or at a store or B2B, they come via ocean or air. But it was always thought of as a separate kind of group. I remember spending a lot of time with the retailers in kind of 2000 to 2008-9 time period, and they were almost in separate buildings, the people itself. Right? There's a group for kind of domestic transportation management, and there's a group for international transportation management. There's someone doing fleet. The parcel was really not thought of. And so what has happened is that we have kind of built a Winchester mystery house for transportation management as a industry, both from process perspective, from people perspective, where things are not really connected to each other. Now, kind of Winchester Mystery House is a museum now. Right? So I think millions of people have gone there. I don't think we want our transportation management as a practice to be a museum. So it's time for us to holistically look at that all these things are connected. Let's architect them so they're well planned, they're well designed, the processes work with each other. And then that's kind of where we are sitting 20 years later. Hope that makes sense. That I don't know if you have ever known about the Winchester Mystery House, but the audience can go and look it up. That what happens when you just keep on building and adding to it for a long time period.
Yeah, no, I've never heard of it, so definitely have to put it on my bucket list of places to see it. I love that as an analogy to transportation management, because you're right. I think we've always talked about the need to break down silos, right, in supply chain in general. But the reality is that those silos have existed within transportation itself, within the functional groups, right, inbound separate from outbound, domestic separately from international. When you talk about parcel, 20 years ago, parcel was something that was only, that people used in the mailroom to ship out, documents and to ship out spare parts, perhaps. So all these things were all managed separately, departmentally, from a department standpoint, from a functional group standpoint. And you're right, a lot of the technology kind of mirrored that. So you ended up having, 5, 6 TMSs or transportation management systems to have to manage each of those, but none of those systems really talk to each other very well. They didn't integrate very well. And I think when you fast forward to today, and I think you see that today, with COVID-19, it's been those companies that have kind of modernized their technology platforms and have broken down those silos organizationally that have been the most successful in navigating through these challenges. So let's talk a little bit about the technology side of things now, because I think as companies have recognized that they needed to break down those functional silos, they've started looking at ways to consolidate and from a transportation standpoint, create a more holistic, integrated technology platform. So we've seen a lot of changes again in TMS over the past 20 years. So in light of kind of the challenges and the history you just talked about, I mean, what capabilities must a TMS provide today, right, in light of the current challenges, in light of where things are heading in the future, in order to help companies succeed moving forward? Yeah,
I think as I reflect on what's going on now and what was going on 20 years back, right? So that saying that goes that necessity is the mother of all invention, right? So what we have seen kind of in the last 3-4 years of the traditional TMS systems couldn't provide visibility. And I again go back to 2001, 2, 3, we had companies like Velocity and Arjun, if you remember them. It was back to the TMS systems at that time didn't provide visibility. And it just became that if you can't see it, you can't optimize it. And then that was the kind of evolution of all even more siloed systems that have come along. My view is, and I think that's kind of the journey we took at Blume when I decided to get back into the logistics side. It took me a while. I was running a company which was in a supply chain planning side. We ended up selling that company to another large player in the supply chain space. Didn't really know if I want to go back to logistics, but I looked at what's really been going around was that people were continuing to build these siloed functions, right? And then that's what I meant by the invention, because it was necessary for you to start looking at how these transportation ecosystems connect with each other. But on technology side, I don't think we will have TMS as a function for a while. You mentioned that kind of in your opening comments. It really is an operating platform, the heart of the supply chain execution for any organization, right? Large or small. Right? The changes that have happened, especially with COVID, right? We saw that every company now is an e-commerce company. E-commerce needs to be a necessity, but now even a small restaurant, kind of they're an e-commerce company. And the person who delivers to your house or my house is the person who is a transportation provider, and that's the last touch to the customer. And so transportation has moved from kind of just being a back office function. Now people are thinking of it that kind of this truly is the function which touches my customer. And there are so many new supply chain models, transportation models, which are possible for us to go build and execute. If you look at transportation management holistically across every mode, whether it's air or ocean or parcel or truckload or less than truckload or rail or bargeage, kind of all of these things are connected with each other. So how do you go and optimize across all of those modes? There's a big component of transportation which is related to kind of your lead times, right? And lead times are variable, right? And then those variable lead times can be looked at, that how do I fulfill my demand the best way by looking at a holistic transportation management system. I will give you one example. And so Christmas is coming up, right? So this year is going to be a little bit different. Right? People are doing more online shopping than before, but we think of kind of that how we do fulfillment for those e-commerce orders for Christmas. There is no reason why you cannot be building products in Asia, if that's where they're getting built, India, putting a label on for a parcel that is going to get executed in Memphis, and putting it into a container, so whether an ocean container or a ULD, and moving it across the world. And then here you will see that all modes of transportation play a role, and all of those are kind of contributing to you fulfilling kind of your consumers demand. So the time has come where we have to kind of move away from these silos. The other part, which is critical on technology side, is what does it really mean to be a cloud-based operating system? Many people just thought that kind of I can do, instead of in-house hosted system, to a system that can be hosted in the cloud or in a SaaS environment. But the true power, which is what we are seeing now, is not about just kind of moving your transportation function to the cloud, but truly using the network and the cloud, so everyone has a shared understanding and a single version of the truth between the partners on the ecosystem. For 20 years, we have talked about that why do we have a function of freight audit and pay where the motor carriers and the shippers cannot agree on what the rates are? Why do we need to go do master data for locations all the time? It takes you a lot of money to go build a new terminal. It's a lot of money to go build a new warehouse, right? Even for the largest retailers, they don't pop up every day. Why do we need to go define it for every company? So the other thing, Adrian, is that back to that, truly use the cloud, which means that we are now talking about shared master data with all the data security, all other things. And what's going on is that traditional TMS systems, it used to take you 6 months to a year to 2 years to fully roll out. And now, because you don't have to worry about master data, you can have common repository of rates and routes, common kind of way of looking at locations, common way of figuring out what equipment utilization is. you can roll these things out in kind of 2-3 months. So the speed and time to market has significantly changed when it comes to transportation technology.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of great, points. I mean, you start out with visibility, and certainly that's something that, remains a core requirement and capability, for companies to have in order to be able to, number one, see what's happening with their shipments, with their orders, et cetera. But ultimately, you need a TMS or an execution and planning system to take that, what you're seeing, and be able to do something with it, right? And that's where kind of the heart of the TMS, comes in. I've been a big proponent for what I've called, network-based solutions or operating systems. So I view a TMS as this, as a great example of a supply chain operating, system. And I think a component of that, which you kind of alluded to, is that, part of what's important today from a TMS is the fact that you've got to be able to connect and communicate and collaborate with a large network of trading partners, whether those are carriers, 3PLs, customers, suppliers, right? So that's a key component of this as well, right? It's the communication collaboration aspect of this.
Yeah, and I think, as you know, kind of 90% of the trucking companies have kind of less than handful of assets, right? But they add up to be a lot of assets around the world, right? So which is what kind of has been that how do you go look at the long tail? And it's reverse of what we talked about 20 years back or 15 years back. Remember the term core carrier program? And core carrier was that let's go pick the biggest carriers which are out there, because we don't want to worry about the long tail which exists of the carriers. Look at ocean rates today. There are 6,900 companies in the US. Only 7 of them have more than 100 million in revenue. Right? And what's going on in LA Long Beach right now, kind of in terms of either the chassis shortage or the container shortage around the world, or the driver shortage, you have to be able to bring every player kind of on the ecosystem. We at Blume released kind of a platform for these small trucking companies last month called Carrier Go Premium. And then the notion was that you can't have a digital supply chain or a digital ecosystem for transportation without making each and every one of these smaller suppliers, smaller trucking companies, also digital. Right? And then it's kind of, we've been calling it democratization of technology for everyone in freight. And then we want to make sure that everyone really participates in this ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. I think that's one big change from 20 years ago. I think really starting to address the long tail of trading partners, whether it's carriers, suppliers, customers, and so forth. And I think it's a reality too that 20 years ago, the main users of a transportation management system were just a handful of people in the transportation department. And now literally today you can have thousands of people that are accessing the TMS in one way or another, whether they're internal folks that are looking for rates, that are looking for visibility, as well as carriers and suppliers and customers that are tapping into the solution to track the status of their orders, their shipments, to upload or update in transit information and the like. So I always make going back to the operating system or platform analogy, I always equate it to what we're seeing now with enterprise systems, and I think transportation is a great example, is what's happened with LinkedIn, Facebook, on the consumer side, right, where you're creating these communities of trading partners hosted on the cloud that's helping to eliminate some of the barriers to communication, collaboration, and connectivity in the flow of facilitating that onboarding process. To your point, I think that's what's facilitating a lot of the faster deployment times that you talked about before. But it's important to recognize that transportation doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It impacts other business processes as well. Warehouse management probably being the most obvious, but how else can transportation management and TMS impact and drive value across the enterprise?
Sure. And I think this is another area where I have been kind of struggling with for last 15 years or so. Right? And it was probably the lone voice kind of 15 years back, talking about that warehousing and transportation are still part of logistics, right? So they need to coexist. Kind of the word had changed to where every kind of container is a warehouse. Every trailer is a warehouse, so you need to be able to kind of treat them as inventory. But the bigger convergence really is between supply chain planning and logistics. Because at the end of the day, logistics is the glue which kind of ties the entire supply chain together. And and it touches your customers, it touches your suppliers, it touches your kind of manufacturing partners. You may have logistics service providers too. But the other area which does the same thing is supply chain planning. Now in retail, they call it merchandise planning. If you're a manufacturer, kind of it's more traditional demand forecasting, supply forecasting, demand supply matching. But guess what? In all of those, with transportation lead time and how I move my goods and how I plan for my transportation is a decision that needs to happen upfront when you're doing supply chain planning, not afterwards. And so in between, I've given up on that term, but I was calling it supply chain amnesia, that the decisions that we make in planning, supply chain planning, are forgotten by the time we get to transportation, and we try to make the same decisions again. Right? Take the simplest example. If you know you have X number of stores, X number of DCs, you know you're going to be doing transportation on a daily basis or a weekly basis between those locations anyway. So there is no point in kind of looking again at what orders do I have today and how do I go do a route planning today, because it's just kind of natural on that side. So these two areas are converging, and they're converging more so with a one fundamental change that kind of is beneficial to people on the supply chain planning side. For all the time, kind of till now, in supply chain planning, the transportation lead time in particular has been looked at as a fixed number. It's a fixed number. If I'm buying it kind of from Asia coming to Europe, it's a fixed number. If it's intra-Asia, it's a fixed number. If it is kind of between West Coast to East Coast, it's a fixed number. So all planning today works on a fixed number for a lead time, and all systems, whether it's SAP or Oracle or my old systems at Steelwedge, they are all designed around this fixed lead time. Guess what? We in transportation know that lead times are variable. We know that lead times vary with cost. We know that there's a trade-off that you can make between cost and speed at which your kind of goods move from point A to point B. And if you're on the planning side is trying to do the same thing. As the demand fluctuates, how do I make sure that I can fulfill that demand in reasonable amount of time so I don't lose the order from the customer perspective? And these two pieces are the glue which are going to bring logistics and supply chain planning together. And we're beginning to see that, but that's kind of the one area where we see tremendous benefits of integrating these two set of processes. And once you integrate them, it impacts your order management, it impacts your customer satisfaction area, it impacts what happens on procurement, that you can start to see the multiple functions of supply chain converging together. But my view, Adrian, is that it all starts off with the lead time and how variable can they be with cost, and how do you integrate those two functions from planning perspective.
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, we talked about earlier in terms of the need to break down these silos, right? And I think that's another classic historical silo that has existed, particularly with planning and logistics and transportation management. And the lead time is, you're right. I mean, I think I know years ago I did some studies around lead time and the impact that has obviously on safety stock, right? Mm-hmm. So when you think about, I'm going to ask you a little bit later about building the business case for a TMS, but I think when you think more broadly and you see how you talked about how logistics and transportation is kind of the glue that or the center, you can almost think about it as the center of the universe for a lot of these supply chain processes, right? But it truly does impact so many other aspects of the bottom line for companies beyond just how much you're paying for freight, right? Because I think that's the most important. That's the initial thing that you look for in a business case. Okay, how much am I going to save on transportation spend? But when you really look at it more holistically, to your point, when you look at it from a lead time standpoint and how that input influences supply chain planning and inventory management, the fact that when you recognize that lead time is indeed variable and not fixed, and if you're able to track that, if you're able to integrate that more smartly, intelligently with planning systems, companies can perhaps save on inventory costs, inventory holding costs, and be able to more dynamically adjust their safety stock levels based on what's actually happening versus, some fixed number that was, calculated, 10 years ago or 5 years ago or even a year ago, and no one has looked at, since. So I think that's an important point there. So keeping on the theme of technology, I mean, we can't, talk about technology without talking about some of the buzz terms, that are out there and things that people are talking about, specifically things like machine learning and AI. I mean, how are these types of emerging technologies transforming transportation management today?
Sure. So I think, so the other one kind of the past to current, right? So the transportation management systems and supply systems as a whole, when I went to school, we talked about that these are decision support systems. You collect information, this is the data, you try to make some decisions, you can do optimization too, but then you leave it up to a human to go make the decision. What's been going on in kind of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we can talk more about it, right? We have actually gone from decision support systems to decision-making systems. Now we are talking about a machine which can make the decisions faster. And then my transition to logistics was from finance. So I worked for some of the largest financial services company in the world. And then our notion was that you actually can't let a human see it because decisions needed to be made kind of in milliseconds. Right? And then that's how the financial world has worked for a long, long time. But logistics and transportation in particular has been that kind of you're making decisions in almost slow motion to some extent. So if you think of the role of AI and machine learning, of course, machine learning is kind of around pattern recognition. Right? So looking at lead time, looking at predictive ETA, there's a big role kind of the machine learning is playing now, even in our systems, on how do you go deploy it. The same thing for cognitive systems. Right? So I think artificial intelligence is little overused, right? So it's been back to that. Are you building a cognitive system where you will be learning and then behaving like a human brain behaves, right? So which is what I call kind of the machine making decisions on that side. The key on that one has been that if you think of all supply chain systems, the processes were built and systems were designed now nearly 40 years back. Think of multi-echelon replenishment. It was, I think, a PhD thesis in 60s at University of Pennsylvania, right? That we still kind of use as the core of kind of inventory management. And at that time, the issue was compute power was very low. So you had to keep on taking the problem and keep on breaking it down. I think it goes with the silos discussion too, right? So we first said that, okay, supply chain is broken up into plan, source, make, deliver. So let's just kind of chunk it up into 4 pieces to begin with. Take, deliver, chunk it up between order management and logistics between other pieces. And so we've been on this journey of that because the compute power was not there. And we couldn't really solve that problem even as a human mind, couldn't really think of all of those. So people became experts in one versus the other. Now, and we kind of rely on Google, we run on Google Cloud, but we also use kind of all of their AI technology like TensorFlow and others. The time has come that how do you go build a machine which will have the collective intelligence of all functions within transportation, whether it's procurement, whether it's fleet management, whether it's other. Collective intelligence of all functions within supply chain, a self-learning machine which can continue to evolve. And autonomous trucking is here, right? Which is an example of what the AI as a technology can do within freight. But if you leave the autonomous trucking out, the same applications are there that how do you go build a decision-making machine. And then the evolution will take few years, but it's kind of closer than any of us think. Right? So the advances are already here. It's just a matter of time, just like it's a matter of time before we see autonomous trucks on our highways.
I love that, the way you phrase it in terms of that transition from decision support systems to decision making systems. And I think you're right. I mean, in some ways, if you were to make an excuse as to why years ago things were so siloed, it was because even if you wanted to take a more holistic and integrated approach to decision making and analysis, the computing power wasn't there. I mean, it would probably take you a week or a month for the computer to analyze all this data and all the constraints and everything else to come out with an answer, and you just didn't have a month to wait for a response. But with everything going on right now with cloud computing, and it's not quite infinite computing power, but for most purposes, it's pretty much close to infinite, for a lot of purposes out there. When you combine the computing power that we have available today with the more advanced algorithms, and I think we're at that, great examples right now where machine learning is playing a role, like you mentioned, with ETAs and so forth. And I think we're only going to continue to see, the rate of innovation in this area, accelerate moving forward. And we talked earlier about, when you talk about integrated and holistic transportation management, and it's not going to be long between, we talked about, integrating parcel with fleet, with ocean, air, truckload, less than truckload. Pretty soon, Pervinder, you're going to have to add drones and driverless trucks and delivery robots as part of your optimization and planning, right? Because those are emerging as delivery modes today. You already see examples of that.
Yeah, and I think I will tell you, for us, the company's roots include doing asset management. So keeping track of where those assets are, except for one asset, which was always attached to a driver, which was truck. Right? So with autonomous trucking, you're actually seeing that the notion of what the fleet management used to look like, whether you're managing your trailers or containers or chassis, and how are you going to go manage your autonomous trucks, that operating platform is going to evolve, where you're not going to have a distinction between kind of what a power unit is, where a driver is needed versus everything else, and how do I keep track of them, and how do I give them instructions, because they will need instructions. So you need an operating platform to sit on top of autonomous trucking to be able to manage transportation holistically. But you're very
Yeah, no, great point. I think this is why, going back to my opening comments, there's always going to be something new to talk about when it comes to transportation management. And I'm sure, if we were to revisit this conversation, a year from now, we'll have all sorts of new things to be, talk about as well along that front. So kind of shifting gears a little bit now. I mean, based on your work with clients, I mean, what are some of the, leading practices when it comes to building the business case for transportation management technology, TMS, holistic TMS, and successfully deploying it? What are some best practices that you see out there?
So I think one of them, and there are multiple facets to it. As you know, at the core of transportation, if you're a transportation person, first thing you're asked about is the cost management. So that hasn't gone away. But the reality is, when we started Blume about 2.5 years back, 2 years back, right, we had Boston Consulting Group come in and look at the data. And the study showed that we still have too many empty miles. The worldwide logistics spend is about $14 trillion. There's at least $1 trillion of waste. And that waste results in a business case, but also is better for the environment. As you know, we contribute kind of to the environment negatively, kind of in many cases on the logistics side. But there's a business case to be made, both on cost optimization, right? And as you remove these silos and optimize as the whole, there are empty mile reduction even in US. Right? So even in US, there are significant empty mile reduction possibilities when you combine your fleet operations with your backhaul with others, or intermodal side, or how do you kind of move empty containers for ocean. There are a ton of business cases which are on cost. And as you look at the cost, it's good to think about kind of what the environmental savings are, because many companies are thinking of kind of what their social and economic kind of implications are, and what we give back to the society. And that's one way of justifying a business case of two types of costs. One is purely kind of a monetary cost, and second is that how can we kind of make it better for the environment too. Second area which has been very prevalent for business cases is, and I think for the business customers than it's for the consumers, because consumers demand it and expect it, but how do you give them Amazon-like experience? And if you're working with a large retailers, how do they know where the trailer is or where the container is, right? So there's a customer satisfaction, customer happiness business case to be made on transportation too. There is still mode shift. Right? So if you go back to that kind of what mode of transportation you're using, those business cases are prevalent too. And then so many more, right? So the more you look at it, kind of it's fairly easy to come up with a business case, but it varies by organization. It depends on the organizational needs. So it's not a one kind of answer on the business cases. So we have had kind of some of the very large users of transportation go with the business cases on empty mile reduction, go with the business cases on kind of mode shift from air to ocean or otherwise. Believe it or not, kind of the whole pool points and pooling and kind of zone skipping still is not as prevalent as it should be, especially with e-commerce. People haven't really thought of that. What does it really mean for parcel zone skipping, and how do I go manage it if I don't have a warehouse or a store in every state in US or every country in the world? So there are a ton of those examples which are there, Adrian, but they vary between kind of, is it customer facing, customer happiness, is it pure cost, or is it environmental kind of savings that you're looking for?
Yeah, I love, I mean, I think one of the things that I've seen that's been a big change over the past 2 decades is that expansion, if you will, of the business case of the value proposition. You know, I point to 2018 as kind of a good year for transportation, not so much from the rates and capacity, because that was an awful year. Most companies, you know, the transportation spend went through the roof in 2018. But it was a good from the standpoint that for the first time at many companies, the CEO and CFO finally paid attention to what was happening in transportation, right? From a cost standpoint, particularly because they saw their, you know, their financials impacted significantly, you know, from that. So transportation spend is always going to be a big part of the, you know, value proposition. But you're right. I mean, we're seeing in my conversation with shippers, customer experience. You know, obviously that's critical on the consumer side of things, if you can, particularly if you're competing with Amazon, but that's becoming in the B2B world as well. You know, the ability to provide that, compete on customer experience is kind of the broad term that I'm seeing a lot of companies build a business case around. And then finally, you know, sustainability, as you talked about. I know in some of the research that we've done, particularly for the younger generations, you know, generation millennials, Gen Z, and so forth. You know, that's something that's particularly important to them in terms of the companies that they want to work for and they want to, you know, be a part of. And that's obviously that's been a topic that over the past 20 years has gotten a lot more, you know, attention as well. So very broad way, there's a variety of different ways that you can justify the investment in this type of technology. Well, Pervinder, as a way to wrap up, then, I mean, what questions should companies ask themselves to assess whether they're, you know, ahead of the curve or behind it when it comes to their, you know, transportation technology, their TMS capabilities?
I think, I mean, some of them are fairly simple. Right? Are you still in an in-house TMS system, or are you in the cloud? Do you look at the ecosystem as your partners, or do you look at them as your suppliers or your motor carriers? Right. So some of these are cultural kind of type of boundaries that companies have to cross. Right? Because at the end of the day, supply chain is a chain, and that chain is kind of linked together by many other companies. So being kind of more open, kind of for companies, if they're still stuck at that kind of, I won't share any data, that can be a good sign of knowing where you are kind of in the journey. It's typically not a good sign that you don't want to share data with your partners. Like, kind of that means you're not a partner. So there's some telltale signs of that kind of, that you're not really where the rest of the world is evolving to. But at the same time, some of the companies have been fairly progressive in looking at even kind of your logistics and planning integration, looking at a lead time, looking at how do I save on inventory. And then again, COVID-19 to some extent has made kind of almost everyone focused on digital. So I think if you had asked me the question about 6 months back or now, I think there's a greater awareness of the impact of transportation, impact of supply chain, I would have never imagined kind of politicians, US politicians talking about supply chain as much as they did kind of at that end of March on almost every TV interview. I will give you one example, which is still out there, is that hopefully we will have a vaccine someday, but no one has really started talking about distribution of that vaccine. And what does it really mean kind of from transportation perspective? Because we have shown that kind of the logistics is the necessity in healthcare, in every type of an emergency service that we can think of, or essential service that we can think of too. So I think companies kind of have to just reflect on what their philosophy is, working on a platform which is a network platform versus kind of looking at their own silos and what it means to them for the long run.
That's a great point. I think that is one of the silver linings of this pandemic, is that it's made supply chain management a household term, right? And you actually see people talking about it. And I know for the longest time, I had a hard time explaining to my neighbors and friends and what it is that I study and research and talk about. And now they're all coming to me saying, "Oh, I heard about supply chain," and they're asking me all sorts of questions now. So I think that's a good thing. I think it's raised the awareness of what the great men and women do day in and day out in this field and in this industry. And so I think it's Pervinder, I think we covered a lot of ground here. As always, you shared some interesting insights and perspective on this topic. So at this time, I want to bring it back to Nicole to see what questions we've gotten from the audience so far.
Yeah, thank you. What a great discussion, and we do have some really good questions coming in. So I'd like us to try to get to 2 to 3 of them if possible. So the first one, I'll just read it out loud. What is your experience with IoT sensors, such as Blackberries and Orbcom, mounted in containers and trailers? Pervinder, do you want to try to tackle that one?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Nicole. If you look at it, we've been on this journey of needing to know where our assets are for 20 some years. Some of us have been in the industry too long to remember Qualcomm and how almost every truck had become that you could know where it is, again, about 20 years back or so. But it has evolved, right? And we work with a number of our customers where we use the sensors to keep track of their assets. But there are 2 types of sensors, and then organizations have to think about kind of what's really needed depending on the business. One of them is purely around the location of an asset or where the container is. It's interesting, but it's not a fascinating use case for a sensor. The better cases of the sensors have been things like reefers, and for the refrigerated products, and how do I know what the temperature is, what the CO2 level is, how do I control kind of the ethanol levels and other things as the trailer or the container is moving. We were talking about pharmaceuticals before. They need to be stored at a certain temperature that cannot vary. If you talk about high-tech equipment should not have any shock. So how do I know that kind of on a pallet I have a sensor which can measure the shock level and knows that it wasn't really shaken too much, or someone didn't really just dump the pallet kind of at the airport? Are all the cases of the IoT devices. They are here to stay. They're getting cheaper every day. The higher the value of the product, the more prevalent we see these days the use of the IoT devices, which is why I mentioned high-tech, the pharma, food products, right? Because on the food products, you don't want your milk to get frozen and then kind of go back to being liquid and get frozen again while kind of you're on a journey. And then the evolution we see is not only that you're sensing, you're also controlling. So the value is not only on sensing, right? There is value. It's value of knowing kind of the temperature is not set right and it fluctuated too much through the journey of a reefer. Right? But the higher value is, can I control it? Can I control it kind of automatically via platform? And those are the type of things we've been working on with our customers today.
Thank you. The next one, Adrian, maybe you can take this question first because you spoke of it earlier, but what do you see as the future of rate management contract rates and spot market rates?
Well, good question. Gosh, if I knew the exact answer, I'd probably be a millionaire right now. That's always a question. People always want to know, what's going to be happening with, contract rates, what's happening on, what's going to happen with the spot market and so forth. I think generally speaking, I think what I hear from a lot of, shippers is, they want to, I think we're moving toward an environment where you're going to see a lot more mini bids, if you will. So this notion of doing a once a year large procurement event and expecting that that's going to be the way those rates are going to hold and that those capacity commitments are going to hold for the rest of the year. I think it's an outdated model. I think everyone knows right off the bat that transportation contracts aren't like other types of contracts, right? Carriers can reject a tender in the truckload space, right? So I think the goal for a lot of shippers is to make sure, Pervinder talked about, control as part of the previous answer. I think it's the same type of thing here, right? Part of it is having visibility, right? So staying informed on what's happening with the market. Part of that is collaborating, having, transparent and honest communications with those core carriers or your strategic partners that you have, right? And making sure that you're having, again, those honest conversations in terms of your needs for capacity and their needs as the market is changing, which might cause them to raise rates or as rates go down. So I think that's going to be part of the key thing is communication, collaboration with your carriers, across all modes. Doing more mini bids, if you will, based on specific geographic regions, specific modes that may be trending in directions that deviate from what you had originally planned, to kind of heal those, if you will, or redirect them into a more favorable direction. And I think, I think at the end of the day, I think you're still going to see that same split, right? 80% or so are going to be via contract. Freight is going to move via contract. About 20% is going to be on the spot market. So I don't think we're going to see a wholesale move away from that, but I think companies are going to take a much smarter approach and a more dynamic approach to how they do procurement, how they analyze the data, so that they're procuring freight and communicating with them to be able to better manage and control their spend versus what happened, let's say in 2018, where they got caught by surprise and the transportation budgets went through the roof. So Pervinder, I don't know if you've got anything to add there in terms of what you're seeing with your customers.
So I think it's a very valid point. I mean, we did, in my prior life, right, we built incremental bid optimizations, even when they were kind of yearly bids, because people were building new warehouses and new suppliers. They came up all the time, right? So it's not a fixed kind of routes that you can really bid on every year. So there's a mix that is going to be there. But the other point that we talked about, Adrian, before, make sure you're connected to all the smaller players and not just the larger players. Even in 2018, part of the issue still was that there were just way kind of too many layers, whether some people call it brokerage, but there was layers around that. How do you get to the capacity when the capacity is tight? Or how do you go and know if that capacity is abundant, and how do I go use it? But key to this is, again, kind of having a network which allowed you to reach out to a large number of motor carriers.
That's a great point. And I think you're seeing that both organically with cloud-based providers, such as yourselves, where you're building that community, that network organically within your platform. And then we're also seeing, in addition to that, connections to quote unquote digital freight brokers or even traditional brokers that are helping to, better integrate transportation management systems with their systems so that, kind of eliminate some of the friction and expedite some of the, that whole process of finding capacity when you need it, when your contracted carriers are not able to take a load for whatever reason. So I think that's some of the things that we're seeing today, again, is the rise of digital freight brokers and their integration with transportation management systems.
Okay, that's great. I think we have time for one more, and I think this dovetails nicely with what you've been talking about through the whole presentation, which is cloud environments. So the question is, how do you see cloud environments like Amazon's AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure impacting transportation management going forward?
Pervinder, you want to go first, and then I'll add anything if I have anything to add.
I think we look at kind of, you mentioned three, two of them are different than the third one, because Amazon is also a logistics provider to some extent. So I know kind of some of our customer base or industry in general has looked at Microsoft and Google differently than they've looked at AWS to some extent. All three of them are here to stay. They're all large, and there are other larger ones too, right? So if you think of Alibaba and Tencent and others in Asia, they're also kind of doing very well, kind of as cloud providers. But it's less about kind of transportation itself. It's more about the underlying technology and how easily accessible it is from the cloud environments. All of them have been working on, we talked about artificial intelligence and machine learning before. You can get those capabilities via your cloud provider. Right? So we mentioned TensorFlow for Blume, because we use GCP, we use TensorFlow, which is native to the Google Cloud offering. So I think of the broader transportation ecosystem, it goes back to accessibility of technology at a lower price point than it would have been possible kind of if you were still in kind of hosted environment, or every company was buying technology just for their own use. Adrian, anything?
Yeah, no, I'll just echo that, and just going back to what we talked about earlier. You talked about how access to now this almost infinite computing power, if you will, is now enabling companies, and specifically in transportation, to be able to take a more holistic and integrated approach to how they plan and optimize and leverage some of these technologies that we talked about, machine learning and so forth. So I think it's opening the door and making that more accessible to a much broader array of companies, not only technology companies like Blume, but also their end users, right? The customers themselves to take advantage, of those, those capabilities. So I see that as kind of, one of the main benefits of this technology. And secondly, we talked about, operating platforms. And one of the things I've talked about is that hopefully down the road we'll see the emergence of what I call the rise of the chief network effects officer, right? So relatively few companies have a chief supply chain officer, and those that don't have one, I suggest skip over the chief supply chain officer and install a chief network effects officer, because I think that's where the next wave of innovation is going to come from, is going to be from companies and individuals in the space that think from a network perspective and from a network effects perspective. And I think that's where, again, cloud technology and some of the core technologies that they bring to the table are going to help enable some of these network effects that offer a lot of promise out in the industry.
Couldn't agree more. Just the term chief network effect officer, Adrian.
Chief network effects officer, yes. I haven't come across any yet, but I think the company that comes up with, installs the first one will at least be thinking in the right direction.
Yeah.
That's great. Adrian and Pervinder, I want to thank you both very much for your time and expertise, for sharing that with us here today at the EDGE 2020 conference. And to attendees, if we didn't get to your question yet, your questions will be shared with Adrian and Pervinder. They'll be able to follow up with you independently. If you still have questions we didn't get to, please feel free to submit those via the platform, and somebody will respond to you. Thank you again. Have a good afternoon, everyone.